In 1984, General Motors introduced the fourth generation Corvette, otherwise known as the C4, and it was about time. The C3 had been in production from 1968 all the way through to the 1982 model year, with relatively few changes during that time frame. There were some minor changes along the way, including in 1978, the backlight was revised so that it could be raised and more access to a small cargo area was then provided. And in 1980, the front end got a minor redesign as well. But a whole new Corvette was certainly something that enthusiasts were pining for. And it was scheduled to be in production ahead of the 1984 model year, but various delays, in part due to General Motors' financial challenges in the early 1980s, pushed the introduction to the 1984 model year. In fact, there is no 1983 Corvette, the only year from 1953 to current day where no Corvette was produced. However, what finally arrived for the 1984 model year was a dramatically new Corvette in most every way, and one that enthusiasts embraced. It was radically different, and yet it still looked like a Corvette. Whereas the 1982 model had bulging fenders, the 1984 styling was toned down a bit overall, but that restraint didn't mean the car looked anything other than an athletic, snarling beast, depending upon what angle you looked at it from. And overall, it was an extremely handsome vehicle with an athletic profile. And while designers arguably exercised some restraint in designing the exterior, it certainly had a number of novel features. The first were the so-called pop-up headlights, which really weren't pop-up at all. In fact, on the C4 Corvette, the headlights actually rotate forward, and this enabled the headlight buckets to be more aerodynamically shaped when they were activated, as opposed to a less aerodynamic shape that most pop-up headlights had. There were also some cool little features like the dual cornering lamps on either side. There were cornering lamps in the front that would illuminate when one turned on the turn signal. And then there were also cornering lamps in the rear that would illuminate if the car were placed in reverse. And of course, you can see here there were fog lights as well. But while the exterior exhibited considerable restraint, the interior of these 1984 to 1989 Corvettes really displayed anything but. Corvette's engineering team and design team went all in on the high-tech theme that was really pervasive in the 1980s, especially across sports cars. And with this instrument panel that looked like it came out of a video game from the era. Gone now were analog gauges, and in their place were liquid crystal displays containing the speedometer, tachometer, as well as various engine readouts that were in the middle of that speedometer and tachometer, all behind a new two-spoke steering wheel. What's more, everything aside from the speedometer, tachometer, and fuel gauge were configurable. For example, you could select between oil pressure and oil temperature in one gauge, coolant temperature and volts in another, the mileage range to empty and the trip odometer in another, and the instantaneous versus the average fuel economy in the final of the four panel displays. It was an interesting approach that hadn't been employed on the Corvette and really hadn't been employed on any other General Motors car by that point, but it worked quite well. And you could also toggle between English and metric units, so if you decided to cross the border into Canada or from Canada into the US, you didn't have to really think about what speed you were going. And of course, all the other displays would also update to metric units as well. There are some other cool and funky touches in the interior as well. Take a look at this door panel, and the first thing you notice is that big courtesy light that is not the typical puddle light, but actually helps illuminate the door handle and the door lock at nighttime. That door handle, incidentally, would be shared with the F cars, the Camaro and the Firebird. And the door lock switch was just standard GM fare, as was the power lock button, which I believe was also shared with the F-body vehicles. But one switch that was not shared is that wiper control that you see there that was on the door. This was an approach that I don't think had been seen since the 1973 Cadillacs, where the wiper switch was incorporated into the door. And you would simply just slide it up if you wanted the wiper speed to increase, and you'd depress it if you wanted to wash the windshield. The center stack area in these Corvettes was relatively plain Jane and a lot of black plastic, as you can see here. And you had a standard GM radio faceplate, although many Corvettes were equipped with the optional Delco Bose GM music system, which is what this particular vehicle has. This is one of the early cars that had this Delco Bose radio, the other being Cadillacs. And they would eventually proliferate to a number of high-end vehicles in GM's lineup. The sound quality was, well, let's just say debatable. Some people say no highs, no lows, must be Bose. And I kind of agree with that. The bass sound from these systems isn't all that great, but the treble is good. And overall, for the era, they sound pretty good. The HVAC controls were also typical GM fare of this era, the two sliders, the top being the HVAC mode, the bottom being the temperature. These had rotary rear window defroster switches that you could turn the rear window defroster on and off. You'll notice that this particular car is also a manual transmission car, and in these early Corvettes, it's a Doug Nash 4+3 manual. 4+3, what does that mean, you say? Is that a 7-speed transmission? Well, not quite. It was really a 4-speed transmission that was equipped with an automatic overdrive that would engage if you weren't really stepping on the throttle that hard in either second, third, or fourth gear. You could toggle it off so that it didn't turn on, but it really was kind of annoying if you left it on, and many people just left it off until they went on the freeway and then flipped the switch on so they got a little bit extra economy. It also wasn't an overly reliable transmission. You could imagine it was pretty complicated. As with the previous generation Corvette, there was a removable roof panel, but now it was one piece as opposed to two pieces with a T-bar in the middle. This gave the driver and passenger more of a feeling of open air, but it also contributed to a lack of overall rigidity in the Corvette structure. Part of this engineers tried to combat by squeezing the structure higher, the lower structure higher, to get more rigidity. And that's why in the C4s, you really sit in a pit. You get in the vehicle and you really sit down in it. You'll notice that frame rail is relatively high with respect to the seat. And that was something that many owners would end up complaining about over the lifetime of this vehicle. The frame was also relatively high in part because the car had a lot of tumble home. In other words, the body surfaces tucked underneath as they went lower, and that again caused that frame rail to be elevated. You'll notice that this car also has the optional sports seats, which were seats that had adjustable bladders for lumbar support as well as lateral support. And in the early years, they were only offered, interestingly, in cloth. You could not get the sports seat in leather. I suppose they thought that, well, leather, you're going to slide around more. But the cloth seats were what you got if you wanted the optional sports seats. Yes, you paid extra for these. And like some other exotic cars, as well as the Pontiac Fiero, the Corvettes got this parking brake on the left side of the driver. So in order to activate the parking brake, you'd pull up on it, and then you could release the lever and put it down so you could exit the vehicle. This was a departure from the C3, where the parking brake was in the middle of the vehicle, so you could just pull it up and leave it pulled up and exit the car. And when it came to luggage space, you got a bit more space in the C4 than the C3. You can see here with the hatch up that there's a decent amount of space to put groceries or even potentially a golf bag. You could put the removable roof there in that area too. There was a place where it would latch in there at the forward end of a luggage compartment. And you can also see the dual Delco Bose speakers there on either side because this car has that optional stereo system. Overall, these 1984 to 89 Corvette interiors, I think, are some of the funkiest and strangest of the 1980s, especially with those reconfigurable liquid crystal displays. Now, one of the things I will say and point out is that the 1985 to 9 displays are slightly different and better than the 1984 display. They're a bit more clear, and the tachometer was also revised because the tune port injection engine, which was introduced for the 1985 model year and made 230 horsepower, had a higher power peak in terms of RPM versus the one-year-only Crossfire injection V8 that the 1984 Corvettes came equipped with, as well as the 82s, and they made only 205 horsepower. So, by the way, if you're looking to get one of these C4s, I definitely recommend getting an 85 or later. The 84 with the Crossfire injection, you're down on the horsepower, and they also revised the ride a bit after 1 year. So many customers complained that the ride was punishingly harsh, and that was due to the fact that the engineers wanted this Corvette to be the best handling vehicle on the market, and ride be damned, basically. So the 84s are a stiffer ride than the 85s and later, and you also don't have as much horsepower, so why not just get an 85 or newer, unless you find an 84 for a super cheap price. Here, by the way, is the 84 Crossfire injection engine under hood. Again, the one-year-only engine has a super sweet magnesium cover or air cleaner to it. That was 1 year only. And there's 2 different intakes that would mate up to intakes in the hood. So it was kind of cool looking, although it just wasn't very powerful. And here you can see an 85 Corvette with the tune port injection engine and those so-called ram air intake tubes. Yeah, again, a cool looking engine and certainly one that was more powerful. You can also see the headlamps in their stowed form here. Again, those would rotate forward when one would turn the headlights on as opposed to just popping up. So overall, these early C4s have some sweet styling on the outside and also pretty cool styling on the inside. And I would say right now they're still pretty cheap, relatively speaking, compared to other collectibles, and pretty numerous. You can find ones with very low mileage for generally reasonable prices, especially the 84 model year and the 85s as well. So if you find one, pick one up, and you got a cheap little way to have a bit of fun. They're not necessarily fast by modern standards, but they're still peppy enough. The Crossfire injected cars are 0 to 60 in about 6.5, 7 seconds. And the tune port injection cars go 0 to 60 in about 5.5 to 6 seconds. So still pretty quick, plenty quick enough to keep up with traffic on today's roads. One thing I was not necessarily a fan of was the interior redesign that came about in the C4 for the 1990 model year. You can see it here. I just call it the plastic fantastic interior, and it looks like every piece is just ill-fitting and it's hard plastic. It's kind of got an interesting overall theme to it, but it just was not well executed, at least in my mind. But you can let me know what you think. It also looks very, well, shall we say 90s-esque, and I suppose the 84 to 89 looks very 80s-esque. So they're period correct, at least, and obviously still a fun car. Thanks for watching this special on the 1984 to 89 Corvette and its cool and funky interior.